as we started doing our research, we began to, study high blood pressure because high blood pressure is a very, very major problem in the country. It's a major cause of stroke and heart failure. And no one really knows the cause, but they knew that it was linked with the kidney and that it had something to do with salt. When we started studying it, we recognized that a substance called uric acid seemed to be important in the pathogenesis or in what causes high blood pressure. And so we started studying uric acid, and as we studied uric acid, we started realizing it was more than just being important in high blood pressure and gout. That's the classic thing that's linked with, but that it was actually involved in obesity and metabolic syndrome and diabetes. As we began to realize that uric acid was really key, we started looking at what raised the uric acid, and that took us to sugar, and particularly to fructose, which is in sugar.
All right, Dr. Richard Johnson, welcome to the Keto Camp podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be on.
I'm grateful that Dr. Michael Gorin connected us, who was on our podcast a few weeks ago, and we had an amazing conversation. He thought we would have a great conversation, and I think he's right. We're going to have an awesome time today. You have a book coming out. I'm going to hold it here for the YouTube audience. Nature Wants Us to Be Fat: The Surprising Science Behind Why We Gain Weight and How We Can Prevent and Reverse It. I am grateful to have an advanced copy of the book, and the book is amazing, and it's actually coming out tomorrow, February 8th. So we're going to put links for all that down below, and we'll get into the book and the amazing golden nuggets that I came across in the book. Before we get to that, I want to hear your story. I know you have been in this space for quite some time, kidney doctor, doing some experiments, figuring out what uric acid does in the body. So how did this get started for you, and what were some of those aha moments throughout your career?
Sure. So I trained as a physician, and I do clinical work. I have a clinical practice, but I also love research, and I ended up studying kidney disease as well as metabolism and also infectious disease. I was kind of I'm a very curious person, and as we started doing our research, we began to study high blood pressure, because high blood pressure is a very, very major problem in the country. It's a major cause of stroke and heart failure. And no one really knows the cause, but they knew that it was linked with the kidney and that it had something to do with salt. And when we started studying it, we recognized that a substance called uric acid seemed to be important in the pathogenesis or in what causes high blood pressure. And so we started studying uric acid. And as we studied uric acid, we started realizing it was more than just being important in high blood pressure and gout. That's the classic thing that's linked with, but that it was actually involved in obesity and metabolic syndrome and diabetes. And as we began to realize that uric acid was really key, we started looking at what raised the uric acid, and that took us to sugar, and particularly to fructose, which is in sugar. And then that kept driving me. So for about 20 years now, I've been studying what causes high blood pressure and diabetes. And it's led to a lot of discoveries. And my research has gone outside the kidney. It's gone outside of classic biologic research. So we do physiology and molecular biology and all those kinds of things. But we also study animals in nature, hibernating animals, long-distance migrating birds. We do studies in history. We actually have resurrected extinct genes. And I've worked with archaeologists and anthropologists, as well as comparative physiologists. And we've done studies in the zoos, and we've done studies on groups that are kind of indigenous groups that live in their ancient ways in the jungles of Venezuela, for example. So it's been quite a tour. It's driven by curiosity, Ben. So that's how and so I'm definitely doing a little bit more than just kidney disease. But this morning, I was rounding on patients with kidney disease.
Okay, yeah.
at the hospital. So
I love that you're curious. I am too. I always ask a lot of questions, which I will do today. Uh,
good.
Uric acid. A lot of people actually come to keto, and they've heard about gout. They've heard about uric acid. They also have high blood pressure typically, and they come to keto to help reduce or lower their high blood pressure. Now, if you could just break down for the person listening or watching, they've heard of uric acid, but what exactly is it? And what is the connection between high uric acid and fructose specifically?
Yeah. So, our body is made up of protein, carbohydrates, fat, and things like bone and stuff like that. But it's also contains substances that are used to make DNA, RNA, the nucleus of our cells. And the DNA and RNA are made of, the building blocks that make it include a group of substances called purines. And these are present in foods, and they're also like present in many different kinds of things in our body. We have a lot of purines in our body, of course, and so it's uric acid is basically when the purines are degraded, they're broken down to this substance, and so uric acid is sort of considered was for a long time was considered a waste product, and when we eat meats and drink beer and eat sugar and things like that, these foods can generate uric acid when we eat them, and then the uric acid is is excreted from the body, and it's most for us we excrete it mainly through our urine and through the gut. So for a long time people thought that it was really didn't really do much in the body. It was kind of just something we had to get rid of, because if it built up, it could form crystals, and especially in the joints. And that could lead to an inflammation and a very painful condition called gout. And many people, there are probably 9 million people in the United States that suffer from gout. And gout is, this condition where uric acid gets to concentration so high that they precipitate into crystals into our joints, typically the big toe. And then that causes a very painful arthritis. And the good news is it usually responds to drugs like Motrin or, over-the-counter drugs like that, indomethacin, and these drugs can take away the pain. And so for a lot of people, it's a real hassle to get this, but after a couple of weeks of treatment, they're back to feeling normal. But what we discovered, and others have too, it's really been a joint. That's kind of funny, a joint joint discovery. Now, what we found is that uric acid, when it builds up in the blood, it has effects that go beyond forming crystals and causing gout. That actually, uric acid has biological effects to cause inflammation. And a lot of people have discovered the importance of inflammation in diseases like high blood pressure and diseases like heart disease. And what we now know is that a lot of people have low-grade inflammation in their blood, and this inflammation can accelerate diseases like atherosclerosis and heart disease. It can be associated with high blood pressure. We see it in people with diabetes. And basically, low-grade inflammation is not a good thing. And what we can show is that uric acid has a major role in causing inflammation. But not only does it cause inflammation, but it seems to be involved in the actual processes that lead to diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, and it has many biologic effects. So the uric acid turned out to be kind of a gold mine, because when we stumbled on it, people were thinking it was just kind of a waste product, and no one was really thinking of it as being biologically active. And our group was one of the very first ones to kind of really tease out the biology of how uric acid works. And it seems to have a fundamental role in a lot of these diseases that people suffer from today.
Why do you think the body is producing this excess amount of uric acid after, your certain lifestyle behaviors? Like, what is the reason behind it? I know that the body, number one priority is survival. Like, why is it producing excess uric acid here?
Well, so, that was the same question we had. Why? Why would we make something that could cause problems, that could kill us, if it gets up too high? And, there are a lot of studies that show that if your uric acid is very high, that it increases your risk for mortality. It isn't just increasing your risk for obesity and diabetes. It's being linked with cancers and all kinds of things. So why in the world would we have a high uric acid? And here's another, challenge, Ben, and that is we had a mutation. We had a mutation in our genes, 15 million years ago that results in humans having higher uric acid levels than almost all mammals. So most mammals have very low uric acid levels, and we have much higher uric acid levels. So that's like a double whammy. So we know it's not doing, when its levels are high, it's not good. And somehow we had a mutation that made our uric acid levels high. And so it turns out that we kind of cracked this when we realized that uric acid was part of a survival pathway that animals use to survive. And what they do is when you're in the wild, one of the most important things is to have enough fuel around. You've got to be able to have enough food to keep going. If we use the food as calories and energy, that powers our thinking, our activity, our ability to do everything, we need to have enough food, and we want to avoid starvation. And fat is actually if we can store fat, we can get away with not having food around. So if we can't find food, we want to have sufficient fat that we can survive on, because when we break down the fat, we make calories. And so we can live just on our fat as opposed to, when there's no food around. So this means that an animal needs to be able to store fat for those times when there's no food around. And it turns out that there are animals in nature that need to store fat. And one of them, of course, is the hibernating animal, the hibernating bear. It has to double its fat before the winter because it's going to go for 4 or 5 months without eating. And so it lives off that fat. Migrating birds, like the godwit, is this bird that can fly like 10,000 kilometers nonstop. And wow. So it does that. Yeah, it does it by just building up fat in its body. And then it can take off and live off the fat while it's flying. And here's another twist. The fat doesn't just provide calories, it provides water. Well, you say, well, look, fat doesn't contain water, and there's no water in fat. But when you burn fat, you actually generate water. In the chemical reactions, you produce water. And 1 gram of fat produces 1 gram of water. So it turns out that when these birds are flying long distance, they're getting their water from the fat they're burning. When the whale is swimming, it doesn't drink seawater. The whale is always swimming, right? So when the whale is in the ocean, it doesn't drink seawater. It has to get its water from the crustaceans and food that it eats. And if it doesn't get enough water, it gets it from the fat it has. And that's why whales are one of the fattest animals in the world. They use it for insulation, but they also use it as a source of water. So it turns out that uric acid is involved in this process to make fat. And so it's actually used, and it works through a very complicated way, but it works through the mitochondria. And the mitochondria are in our body, it's what makes energy. And basically, when you make energy, you can make energy that you use immediately, which is ATP. And that's how we, do what we do, run, walk. Yeah. ATP is the key, having a lot of ATP. But ATP is kind of the immediate energy. And then there's the stored energy. The stored energy is fat and glycogen. So when your body is trying to make energy from food, normally it will make ATP because it doesn't want you to be fat. But if you turn on a process, if the animal wants to turn on a process to store fat, then actually it has to trigger a switch. It turns out that it triggers a process that instead of making just a lot of ATP, it will shift the calories to stored energy like fat. And that is an actual biologic switch that our group had a lot to do with discovering. And it's essential to that is a sugar called fructose, which when it's metabolized produces the uric acid. And the uric acid and the fructose are working together to cause fat storage. So what happens is like a bear, when it's preparing to hibernate, the question is what triggers it to suddenly eat more? And it will double, triple what it normally eats. It will eat 10,000 grapes in one 24-hour period. I mean, it will eat huge amounts of fruit, and a lot of animals will do this. And we think of fruit as healthy, but you're not eating 10,000 grapes. You're not eating the amount of fruit these guys are eating. These guys are eating huge amounts of fruit where there's so much sugar that in the end, they're getting a lot of this fruit sugar or fructose. And that when you eat enough of it, it triggers this production of uric acid. The uric acid goes into those energy mitochondria and does this switch, or a biologic switch, switches from making a lot of ATP to storing the energy in fat. And that switch is triggered by what we call oxidative stress. So uric acid is actually important in survival. So the question was, what happened 15 million years ago? Because back then we had much lower uric acids and we could still make fat. But what happened was, I was very curious. I'm very curious, Ben.
I see that. I love it.
And so what I did was, I love Google and I love all these ways you can pull articles from. You can go back and pull articles from like 1900 off of Google Scholar and 1800 and in the old days you had to go to these libraries and go from stack to stack, but nowadays anyone can become a sleuth. And so I was very curious what happened 15 million years ago to our ancestors. And back then our ancestors were kind of an ape-like animal that was the ancestor of apes and humans. And they were living in Africa. And I read that there was global cooling, not global warming. Global cooling was happening. And what was happening was the polar ice caps were growing and the sea levels were falling. And what happened was Africa, which was where these ancestral apes were, these apes were living in tropical rainforests. They were eating fruit. They were living in the trees. They were very successful. These were a big leap over the prior species, which were more like monkeys. These guys had big heads. They were tailless. They were much stronger. They were smarter. They were the beginning of the apes as well as humans. And these guys were very successful. They were living in the tropical rainforest, and suddenly there were many species. There were like 20 species of ape. And then what happened when the sea levels fell, Africa, which had been an island, basically was not connected with Europe. Suddenly there were land bridges, and these animals, along with a ton of other animals, went across that land bridge into Asia and Europe. And it was warm up there. Back then it was very warm. Global cooling was occurring, but at that time it was still fairly warm. And what happened was there were actually fruit trees and so forth, and a lot of rainforest that was even in Europe, and then it kind of got cooler and the rainforest began to thin out, turn into more of a deciduous forest. And these apes were still kind of living off the fruit. That was the main thing they ate, and they could eat it year round. And then as it got cooler, around 50 million years ago, there wasn't enough fruit all year round. So there was a few months where there would be no fruit. And they started starving during that time because they weren't used to eating other foods. And so they actually had to come out of the trees, and they started foraging around looking for tubers and roots and other things they could eat and nuts. And during that time, it was a period of rapid evolution because they had to change, their dentition changed so they could eat harder foods. They began to knuckle walk and their skeleton started to change. And they had a mutation at that time in uric acid. And that uric acid mutation, normally back then, the way animals got rid of uric acid is they would degrade it. They didn't have to get rid of it through the kidney. They didn't have to get rid of it through the gut. They just degraded it. They had an enzyme that would break it down. And it was very easy. But they mutated that off that enzyme. So they lost that enzyme. So now the uric acid had to be excreted by the kidney and the gut, and it ended up with the uric acid levels going up about, almost doubling. And what happened was that mutation, we said, okay, if uric acid is important to help store fat from sugar or from fructose, if it's involved in how fructose causes the storage of fat, then if there's too little fruit around, then could that mutation have allowed the little fruit to be more powerful in its ability to store fat? Maybe you could store more fat from the same amount of fruit because you would produce less ATP, but you could produce more fat. Mm-hmm. And that would help you in the long term. So we started looking at that. And I went to Europe, met with this famous anthropologist, and he ended up collaborating. Peter Andrews was his name. And he, told me that this made a lot of sense and that the starvation was going on in Europe. And he had discovered that our ancestor came from an ape from Europe, and that ape had migrated back to Africa at some point. And he had shown by fossils that our ancestor was actually an ape that had gone from Africa to Europe and then back to Africa. And he had a paper in Nature, so that we knew that. But yet all those apes were starving in Europe, and eventually they went extinct. So some ape up there, some little group of apes made it back, and or ancestral apes, and they ended up to evolve into humans. And they came back with that mutation. And we know that they got that mutation because we can actually identify it through molecular evolution. We can tell. So the question was, how did that mutation work? So with Eric Gosher, we resurrected the extinct gene. We actually were able to figure out the extinct gene. We resurrected it, put it in a cell culture system, and we could show that when liver cells, human liver cells, had that gene, they made fat in response to fructose. They did. But if you mutated it so they got a bigger uric acid response, then when they got fructose, they made a huge amount of fat for the same amount of fructose. So it like doubled, tripled the amount of fat you could make from the same amount of fruit. And so we had a mutation occur. And then what we did is we took mice, and mice are fairly resistant to sugar, but when we knocked out that enzyme or inhibited it to make it kind of like a human, then suddenly they were very sensitive to sugar. So humans are very sensitive to fructose, and fructose is in table sugar. It's in high fructose corn syrup. And so we are very sensitive. We react to it much more. We were trained. We have the genetics to try to make more fat in response to sugar than others, than other species. So we are sugar sensitive.
That is, yeah. It's fascinating. And so you fast forward to today, and you have, of course, people juicing their fruits, so they're even making it worse by removing all the fibers and increasing that sugar load.
Yeah.
So when you talk about this switch, right? This switch to burn fat is blocked, and now we're storing fat. So instead of using ATP for energy, we're using body fat for energy. And a lot of people in America have lost the ability to burn body fat and use ATP, get into ketosis, etc. So with that conversation, and then the conversation on the other side saying, hey, if you want to lose weight, all you have to do is just exercise more and get into this caloric restriction philosophy. I mean, what do you have to say to those people? Because they're saying our conversation is it's complicated, what we're talking about, and it's a very simple math equation. So what do you say to those people?
Yeah. So the first thing is that, there's two big processes going on. And one process is that there's a switch that when it turns on, tries to get us to make fat. And the main thing driving that turned out to be carbs. And it isn't just the fructose and sugar. So table sugar, it contains fructose as well as glucose.
Mm-hmm.
And high fructose corn syrup also contains fructose and glucose. It's actually the fructose that really is driving this fat switch. But what's scary is that our bodies can make fructose. And this was another terrible discovery. Our bodies make fructose. There's only one way we make fructose. There's only one pathway. But that pathway is turned on in a variety of situations. And the number one situation is when you eat potatoes and rice that does not contain fructose, but it contains what we call high glycemic carbs. When the blood glucose goes up after you eat this, that actually triggers this response in your body to make fructose. And you will start making fructose in response to these carbs. And that's why carbs are driving obesity dramatically, because you're getting sugar, which has fructose in it, and then you're getting high glycemic carbs that are being converted to fructose in the body. There are other things that can also produce fructose, like, unfortunately, and we can talk about that later, but this is the main pathway. And this is why your diet that you keep promoting, the keto diet, is so strong and so powerful, because it's blocking these two major food groups, fructose and high glycemic carbs. You're eating less of them, so that makes this huge improvement that tries to keep us from activating the switch. Now, well, that's good. The other big aspect of it is that the way the switch works is this uric acid causes oxidative stress to the mitochondria. And oxidative stress is sort of like UV light, sunburn is like oxidative stress to the skin. Smoking generates oxidative stress that can cause wrinkles, for example.
Yeah.
Oxidative stress is this kind of mysterious thing where the oxygen becomes chemically reactive and can damage your tissues. And oxidative stress is actually used to do the switch in the mitochondria, because when it's in there, it shifts it from making ATP towards making fat. So it's actually used as a good thing to help animals survive in preparation for periods where there's no food. So it's supposed to be good. But if you're eating food that's always, every day you're doing oxidative stress to those mitochondria, they're under attack. It's fine to do it a little bit, like, for a few months to gain the fat and then burn it off. But if you're doing it day in, day out, every time you're eating a cookie and all this stuff, what happens is the mitochondria start to weather. They start to decrease in their ability, and they can't recover fully. And they get this low-grade damage. And there's it's trying to repair itself. There's all these mechanisms to try to keep them healthy, but over time they start to decrease. And as the mitochondria decreases, then the capacity of the mitochondria to produce the energy you need goes down. And so suddenly you become more fatigued, you're more tired. It correlates with a drop in mitochondria. It correlates with a decrease in ATP in the muscle. It correlates with getting older. It correlates with a slower gait when you're walking. And so when you want to get back to your normal health, you want to get back to your dream health, you have to do two things. You have to know how to turn off that switch so that you're not killing those mitochondria, but then you have to know how to revive the mitochondria. And the people who love exercise, they love it because it isn't that exercise helps you lose weight by burning calories. The amount of calories you burn for the amount of exercise you do,
it's not much.
Is woeful.
Yeah. Well, people misinterpret that all the time because they're like, "Oh, I did a workout and I burned 600 calories." No, you didn't, because if you sat on your couch, you probably burned 450. So
exactly,
you really burned 150. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not about burning calories. It's great to burn calories. Okay, it's great to burn calories. It's great. It's not, but that's not the benefit you get from exercise.
Correct.
It's not that. It's when you exercise, you actually do things that help the mitochondria regenerate. And this mitochondrial ability of the mitochondria, the term is biogenesis, mitochondrial biogenesis, but the mitochondria regenerate. They can go back to normal. And when the numbers go up and the function of the mitochondria improve, your energy improves. It's easier to keep the weight off. So you can diet all you want, lose the weight, but if your mitochondria are bad, you're going to reset to that original, back to that weight. And so that's why when you're young and you gain weight, you can actually lose weight much easier. If you're 18 and overweight, you can get back to your weight very easily because your mitochondria are still fairly healthy. But if you've been overweight for 20 years, it is a battle to get back, but it's not impossible. Mm-hmm. And so the fantastic thing is you do things like the keto diet or fasting, or there's different diets. I have a diet that kind of hits all the different things that activate the switch. But but all these are fairly close. And then you do exercise to try to stimulate that mitochondrial replication, and then you've got the dynamic, the two-hit thing to give you back your health.
Oh, that's so well said. So low fructose, low carb diet could be called keto. Combine that with exercise to kind of stress the mitochondria. I call it sometimes mitochondrial fitness. And that's a 1-2 punch to overcome whatever kind of metabolic disorder you might be dealing with. And you talk a lot about this on page 195. You relate, obesity to the energy production, the mitochondria, and you talk about how it's possible to restore and repair these mitochondria. And you're explaining exactly how to do it. I do have a question for you, though, because you mentioned that, yes, you could eat fructose and get fructose that way, but you could also eat high glycemic foods and your body could make glucose through one pathway. What was the name of that pathway?
It's called the polyol pathway. There's only one way our body can make fructose. We make it from glucose through a thing called the polyol pathway. And that polyol pathway gets activated when we're under stress. So it gets activated, for example, if you're not getting enough oxygen, if you're under extreme stress, but it's also activated by certain foods. And this is what animals do. So they high glycemic carbs, when the blood glucose goes up, that activates it. Another is really salty foods. I hate to tell you. So here's what's interesting. I would love to do a study. I probably will do a study like this. Potato chips versus chips, or French fries with salt versus French fries. Potato chips with or without salt, or French fries with or without salt.
Got it.
Now, we know that the salt makes it taste a lot better, and so you eat more. But if I controlled how much you ate, my bet would be that the salted French fries will still cause more obesity because the salt turns on the enzyme to convert the starch in the potato to fructose. So the starch is like a lot of glucose together is starch. Starch is basically glucose. And so when you eat it, your blood glucose goes up. And that will convert to fructose. But if you have salt there, The salt really drives that process even more. So you'll make more fructose. And, we've done studies where we've given people like salty foods and so forth, and we can show that we can activate the switch just immediately with like a bowl of salty soup. Every time you eat salt and you get thirsty, you're activating the switch to help convert the glucose in your body to fructose. So, I know what you're going to say. Wow, what are you telling me? Salt can cause obesity? Yes, that's what I'm telling you.
But you're saying that in the context of salt with carbohydrates, not necessarily.
Yes. Salt alone, salt has no calories, right?
Yeah.
But salt turns on the enzymes to convert the starch to, so if you're on a keto diet and you're not eating much carbohydrates and you're not making much, and you don't have much glucose to convert, you probably can eat salt without a problem. But if you're eating French fries, you're going to get that extra whammy of the salt with the potato. That's why French fries are so fattening. It's not that they contain sugar. They don't contain much sugar. They contain glucose, a starch, but they don't contain table sugar. They don't contain fructose. I do want to, Ben, I want to say one thing because, we've been slamming fruit as a mechanism for causing obesity. But, the truth is that humans are not eating the same amount of fruit that animals do to become fat. And I just wanted to point out that there's a difference between eating a whole fruit that has fiber and potassium and flavonols and vitamin C and all these things that actually help counter some of the effects, and drinking a soft drink that's got 10 times more fructose, and you drink it in 30 seconds. So when you take a soft drink, you're just you're activating the switch like bingo. If you eat a natural fruit, it has like 1/10 amount of fructose or 1/4 amount or 1/5, and it's got all these other things in fiber. It's absorbed slower. There's less fructose, and actually, the natural fruit contains so many good things that there's no real anything bad from that. In fact, the natural fruit's good. And we did do a study where we took people who are overweight and we put them on a low fructose diet where it was low sugar and low fruit. And we put the other group on a low sugar diet, but they were still able to eat fruit. And both groups did great. Both groups had an improvement. So natural fruits themselves, you can eat, you certainly can eat some. Now, if you eat a ton of fruit, like a big bowl of grapes in front of the TV, you're going to get into trouble. In my book, I actually go through the different types of fruit and, how much is good. But basically, we should view natural fruit as our friend, not as our enemy. But fruit juices, where you take 5 fruit and make a smoothie, now you've got this. You've removed a lot of the good stuff and fiber, as you pointed out, and then you drink it really fast, and then you get a big bolus of fructose. And the other thing to know is that the way the switch is activated, it isn't from the calories of fructose; it's from the concentration. Which so if you had a soft drink and you drank it really fast, you're eating a lot of fructose in a short period of time. So the concentration is very high. And when the liver gets this wave of fructose, it activates the switch like that. But if you sip the fructose, if you sip the soft drink and took one sip, and so that very little fructose got to the liver, because even though there's a huge amount in the glass, you only took a tiny bit, and then you drank that whole glass over 24 hours. You took a sip every 15 minutes. The fructose concentration will never get to the level to activate the switch, in which case the soft drink just becomes the calories in the soft drink, which can be significant, but it's not huge. It's not making you want to make fat. So it turns out that it's kind of sneaky. So liquid fructose, liquid drinks are 100 times worse than solid foods that have sugar.
Interesting. Yeah, I love that you shared that. We're not saying all fruit is bad. We're distinguishing between fruit juice and actual fruit. With that being said, if you're somebody who's obese, diabetic, it might be a good idea to lower your fruit intake to get into ketosis and then eventually bring it back in. That's kind of the way I teach it.
Absolutely. I totally agree with it. And there's another great benefit of ketosis. It turns out that when you eat sugar, you have to absorb the sugar, right? You break the sugar down in your gut and then you have to absorb it. And the ability to absorb sugar varies from people to people. So if you're eating sugar every day, you're going to absorb the sugar very fast because your intestinal lining changes so that you can absorb it faster. The body likes sugar. It shouldn't, but it thinks it does. And so it will try to absorb more. And so if you put an animal on a high sugar diet, it will learn how to absorb it fast and absorb it very efficiently. But if you don't eat sugar, those transport systems to transport the sugar into the body get turned off. It's like rebooting. They go way back down to low levels. And when that happens, like on a ketosis diet, and it only takes like 10 days or so to turn it off. So every time you go on a low carb diet for like 10 days, you're rebooting the system and you're turning that off. And then the same amount of sugar is not going to be absorbed as readily as it was before. So you're going to gain another benefit. Of course, you're not eating sugar,
Yeah.
but when you eventually go back to, less, going back to some kind of carbs, which ultimately we all do, right? So, that'll help a lot. Yeah, we did this study that was kind of fun. We did it in, we took children who had been diagnosed with fatty liver, and they'd been diagnosed with a biopsy. So these kids are overweight, obese, and they have fatty liver, and they're only like 15 years old. It's not great.
It's awful.
And then we had some kids that were overweight or obese, did not have fatty liver, at least at that level. And then we had some normal kids, and we gave them everyone took one dose of fructose, and we could measure how much they absorbed. The kids that were thin, they couldn't absorb the fructose very well because their systems to transport it were kind of turned down. The kids that were overweight, they could absorb the fructose much more. And they also could metabolize it faster. They could break it down. But the kids with the fatty liver, they were the best. They were the ones that could absorb almost all the fructose, and they could metabolize it very, very rapidly, showing that their system was upregulated.
Interesting.
So if you take a person with fatty liver and you put them on a keto diet, you're going to have a dramatic effect on their fatty liver.
Yeah.
It's going to be dramatic because you're really, it turns out that sugar is the number one driver of fatty liver. And you're going to not only remove the sugar, but you're going to turn off the transport systems. You're going to help them a huge amount. And I personally have treated, some people with fatty liver, including children, by just restricting the carbs and taking away the soft drinks. But wow, what a difference that makes.
Yeah, outstanding. I have a follow-up question on the pathway. I want to know if I'm saying it right. Is it called the polyol pathway?
Yeah.
Okay, the polyol pathway. I find this fascinating. I haven't really studied too much about it besides your work, and I have a follow-up question on it. So you mentioned that if you eat high glycemic foods, you could turn on this pathway, polyol pathway, where your body then actually makes its own fructose. You also said in a stressful state, you could also turn on this pathway. So my question is this, and thought process is this. I know that stress is a silent killer, mental, emotional stress, and just being in a state of fight or flight all the time. One of the reasons why it could make you gain weight is the response of cortisol and glucose following cortisol. But my thought process now is if you're in a stressful state from work, watching the news all day, whatever it is, are you going to be turning on this polyol switch and storing fat instead of using ATP for energy?
Yeah, so this switch does a number of things. It does store fat and it produces less energy. So that's true. But it also makes the cells require less energy. So everything, the metabolism slows down. So it tries to slow it down, because if we can slow down the metabolism, then the cell has that you have a better way, a better chance to survive.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, under low oxygen conditions, the animals will start to make fructose. And there's a naked mole rat, which that's what they call it. It's this funny looking animal that lives in Africa, and it goes down these burrows where there's like very little oxygen, and they're like way down under the ground, and the oxygen level is so low that if you put like a mouse in there, they'll die because there's oxygen so low. But these animals live by making fructose with the polyol pathway, and what they do is they shift. So when you make ATP in the mitochondria, you use oxygen. So one of the main reasons we need oxygen is for our mitochondria to make the energy we need. So if we don't have enough oxygen, we can't make the energy very well. But there's a backup system, and it's called glycolysis. And this backup system makes energy without oxygen. And so if we can, but it doesn't make it as much. It's much less efficient. So what happens is this switch, for example, switches from this oxygen demanding system to a low oxygen system to help you survive under low oxygen settings. It also, for example, makes you insulin resistant. Why do you want to be insulin resistant? Why is that a survival mechanism? Because our body likes to use glucose as a fuel. Now, when you go on a keto diet, it's a different story, right? But normally the body uses glucose as its fuel, and the muscle uses it, and the liver uses it, and the brain uses it. And glucose is the main fuel. It's the main carbohydrate fuel in our body, the main carbohydrate fuel. And we have circulating glucose in our blood that's used to go to the muscle and everywhere. Okay, so the muscle uses a huge amount of the glucose, and the brain uses about 25% of the glucose. It uses a huge amount too.
Yeah. So
let's say there's not enough food around. Well, what do you want to do? If you don't have enough food, do you want to reduce the glucose evenly? No, you don't. You want to be able to think, because even though muscle is so important and strength is so important, if you're not thinking, you're dead. Yeah. So what they want is to get enough glucose to the brain. And so what insulin resistance does is it reduces the amount of glucose that gets into the muscle and into the liver and into the fat. But the brain, much of the brain does not require insulin to move glucose in. So we use this hormone insulin to drive the glucose into our cells. So if you become insulin resistant, what happens is the tissues become resistant to the effects of insulin to move glucose into the cells. So the skeletal muscle doesn't get as much glucose, even though it's higher in the blood. It's higher because it's not getting into the muscle. And so the blood level goes up, which is great because the brain can use the glucose without the insulin. And so insulin resistance is a way of shunting the glucose that's available from the skeletal muscle to the brain. So the brain gets, and so that's part of the switch too. So the switch is making you insulin resistant to help preserve glucose to the brain. It's reducing our oxygen needs. It's storing fat. It's actually stimulates foraging so that you're looking for
makes
food.
Sense. Yeah, it makes sense. You want to be alert. You want to be able to see
exactly.
a predator. Yep.
And you got to make fast decisions. You have to be able to, and so interestingly, it slows your metabolism, but when you're resting, not when you're in activity. Because when you're foraging, you want to have that metabolism. You want to be looking around. You want to have the energy going. But when you rest, you want to really let things drop so that you can, So the way the switch works is it decreases metabolism during rest, not during activity. And anyway, it's a brilliant system. But when you overactivate it, the insulin resistance starts getting to be high glucose in the blood, high hyperglycemia, diabetes. The blood pressure also goes up a little bit because you want to have good circulation. But now, instead of the blood pressure going up a little bit, it's going up high and you're developing hypertension. The foraging is great initially because you're kind of looking around. But if you do it chronically, what happens is you suddenly you can't concentrate because when you're foraging, you don't want to concentrate on one area. You want to make rapid decisions. And so suddenly now you're making rapid decisions. You're not thinking things through, and we call it ADHD.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, nature wants us to be fat because, we've activated a system to help us survive. And it's great in a setting where there's not a lot of food around, but we are in a world where we can order anything we want. We can go to the grocery store and there's 30,000 items to pick from. And, this is our problem. And so this is what the book's about.
Yeah, and the book is fantastic. So everybody watching and listening, go buy it. It's going to be available tomorrow, which is going to be February 8th. This episode's coming out February 7th. And as you can see on YouTube, here's the book right here. Is the best place to get it on Amazon, or is there anywhere else you want to go for that?
There's many sites, Barnes & Noble's, Books A Million, but Amazon's a nice place to go to.
We'll put the link for Amazon down below. We'll also put the link for you have other books out there. You have the Sugar Fix, you have the Fat Switch. So we'll put links for those as well. And this is super fascinating. I just love, it's so interesting to hear how we have evolved over the years to see it's all back to survival. I mean, the number one priority for the body is survival. And if you could view all the things that are happening in your body from the survival lens, it's going to make a lot of sense to you.
As a person who's done medical research for, 20 years, 25 years, what I've learned is that understanding, how we got here and what we call the evolutionary biology is so incredibly insightful when it comes to trying to understand disease. And this is a great example. This story is a great example of how, something that was built in a long time ago to help us survive is actually backfiring now and causing a lot of problems.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Well, you do a good job at helping people become aware, and I hope the keto campers are now aware and they make a better choice. So go get the book so you can understand it some more. Besides the links we're going to put down below, where else can they check you out?
I do have a website, drrichardjohnson.com. And we're putting lots of little stories in there. And, I think it's an interesting website because you can actually learn. There's a section there where we talk about nature and also some of the controversies going on in obesity and diabetes research and so forth.
Awesome. We'll put that down below. We'll put your socials as well. Thank you, Rick, for coming on the show. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to having another conversation with you.
Thank you, Ben.